If this gets...
This is Richard Wolff
We'll see if
from
this gets
Democracy
boring.
at Work, responding to
maybe
another
it won't.
Ask Prof.
Maybe it
Wolff
will.
question from our Patreon community. This question comes from Nicholas Cuevas, and I want to answer his question, which basically asks me to explain the meanings of terms like historical materialism, dialectical materialism, dialectics, and so on. These terms have a long history in philosophy generally, and particularly in Marxian or Marxist-inspired philosophical debates. They aren't quite so frequent these days, but like everything else in the way of socialism and Marxism and so on, it's experiencing a renaissance, a reinterest, a rebirth, a renewal. And I think basically that is a good thing, since there are enormous insights to be recovered from.
Richard Wolff is so optimistic. He's always, you know, avoiding left pessimism. He's always talking about how Marxism, socialism, communism are becoming more popular again, how capitalism is failing after 40 years of neoliberalism, how the contradictions in class struggle is intensifying. I like it. I'm a fan of Richard Wolff, even though obviously he's not like a Marxist-Leninist, but it is what it is. Not everyone needs to call themselves a Marxist-Leninist in 2021. As long as you're out there doing the work, talking about economics and talking about organizing and getting people organized, you're cool with me.
And made use of, developed out of that tradition. Okay, well, let's begin with dialectical materialism. And to get at that, we begin with the materialism part. In this view, the history of human thought, of philosophy, of thinking about what life is, what the world is, there are two broad strains of thought, one the reverse of the other. The way this approach goes, there are two realms, two kinds of reality in the world. One is the hard material reality, the things you can touch and see and hear and smell, the earth, the air, the food we eat, the people we encounter. These are the material reality. And then there's another kind of reality, what's in our minds, ideas, concepts, thoughts, spiritual meanings, things like that.
And the main question posed by philosophy since Plato and Aristotle has basically been the relation between idea and reality and the material, thought and the material. And different philosophers have had different things to say about that. Obviously, you can go a lot of different ways with that question, but that's the main question posed by philosophers, and that's what people believe, like a lot of people believe, like Hegel and Marx kind of brought an end to, as I'm sure Richard Wolff is going to talk about here.
The debate, this perspective says, has always been which determines the other. In other words, do the thoughts we have come out of the material reality we are born into, live through, and die from, so that the material shapes the ideal, that's the name for the other realm of our reality. That's called materialism, if you believe that somehow the hard reality is first and foremost and determines the realm of ideas.
I don't get how anyone can even argue against materialism anymore. Cause like look at the field of engineering, right? The different developments that are made in production and machinery, right? Those don't come from, they come from people's heads, right? But they come from people using their material bodies, which are connected to their material brains, to work with material things, you know, to figure out equations and theory based on the material world, based on, you know, physics and what they're observing with the machinery, in order to make improvements and improvements and improvements. So it's like so obvious that knowledge comes from the material, right? Knowledge comes from our brains, which are made of material, interacting with the world via consciousness. And, you know, that's kind of, I feel like it's almost obvious at this point. And, you know, and even this is my wrestling perspective, my sports perspective that I always have to bring into it. Like, any good team you need to have, like, a good culture. You need to have people whose actions are positive, who are building each other up, who are working hard, who are feeding off of each other. And then that has an effect on everyone on the team, right? Even the laziest kid is going to work a lot harder if you have this group of people who are working hard. So your environment and the people you surround yourself with becomes you. it shapes who you are in many ways. So that's just one of many, many examples of how our thoughts and our consciousness are come from the material reality that we find ourselves in and that we operate within.
The reverse is idealism. And it holds that no, in the beginning, notice the language, in the beginning there was the Word. The way the Bible opens. In the beginning is something spiritual, something ideal, maybe a deity, a non-material, godlike something. This idea then says that idealism comes first. The idea precedes the reality, shapes, causes the reality.
Another one, try and invent a color right now. Think of a new color that's never been thought of before in your head. I bet you can't do it. We can mix colors. We can take two different colored paints and mix them together and make a third color out of the material paint. But you can't just think up a new color in your head because you haven't seen it materially. Because idealism, the idea that the reality is shaped by the ideas of humans, not the reverse, and not a relationship between human consciousness and the world, is goofy. Idealism is very goofy.
Not the other way around. And this either or has been understood by many as the great philosophical debate that has dogged the human race, inspired the human race for centuries. Okay, so materialism, that tradition, goes back at least as far as the ancient Greeks, and no doubt further. That is understood by most Marxists in most of the tradition, as well as non-Marxists in many other traditions. Materialism is the notion that the hard reality of our physical selves, the physical world around us, our interactions to survive and grow in that environment, that material reality is primary and is what shapes whatever ideas, concepts, thoughts, and spirits we think are there. What is dialectics then? Well, dialectics began in its modern formulation with ideas that are old, but that were brought together in the most powerful way imaginable by the German philosopher Hegel, a teacher of Marxism. And Hegel's notion was, yeah, idealism comes first. He was a good Christian in that way. But he saw a very complicated relationship between the ideal and the material. And it wasn't simply one determined the other, but a kind of back and forth between them.
Yes, and Hegel was idealist, right? He did have idealism, but he's not idealist in the way that some people imagine. So I'm not a Hegel expert by any means, but Carlos has been reading a lot of him, and we talk about Hegel all the time, pretty much every day at this point, because Carlos has been reading it every day. And he's not idealist in so much the way that people think, right? He's not idealist in that he thinks everything is shaped by idealism. He thinks there's a relationship between thought and reality. And he talks a lot about labor and how labor is like this mediation between the human mind and nature. So it's not like, and obviously labor is a concrete act, right? The activity of laboring on something to make a product is a concrete material act, not an idealist act. So Hegel dealt a lot more in the material than, people probably think when they hear that he's an idealist thinker. He just had a lot of idealism that was like kind of done away with by Marx and critiqued by Marx. But it's very complex and honestly over my head, at least to the point of explaining it. It'd be very hard to explain. I probably would not do it justice.
Marx developed this idea much further, insisted that he was a materialist, Marx, and most Marxists have agreed, but that he wasn't about to say that the material determines the ideal, end of story. No. That Marx criticized as mechanical materialism. He distinguished his own view as dialectical materialism, and here's roughly what he meant. The material is in some way...
Sorry, I missed what Richard Wolff said there. I was reading the chat. I gotta go back.
That Marx criticized as Marx developed this idea much further, insisted that he was a materialist, Marx, and most Marxists have agreed, but that he wasn't about to say that the material determines the ideal, end of story. No. That...
Right, because he couldn't, because he was the head of philosophy for whatever institution he worked for, and at the time you couldn't come out against the church. You couldn't come out against religion, so Hegel couldn't even really go that far and be safe.
That Marx criticized as mechanical materialism. He distinguished his own view as dialectical materialism, and here's roughly what he meant. The material is in some way primary. It shapes our ideas, our spiritual notions, our religions, our cultural institutions, and so on. The material shapes the ideal, but here comes the big idea, it goes in reverse too. The relationship between materialism and idealism is dialectical. And by the way, the word dialectical comes from dialogue. When you have a dialogue, two different people are talking to each other. Each one is speaking and listening, articulating and learning. This notion of the back and forth interplay is what Marx wanted to add to materialism. A respect for the idea in the world, shaped by the material, but having a reverse impact. So yes, the material world shapes the ideal aspects of the world, but so does it in reverse. Most Marxists finishing this idea by saying it's an interaction. Materialism is a dialectical relationship with ideas.
It's a really good explanation. Pat on the back for Richard Wolff.
But it's back and forth. The material is the more important shaper than the ideal. So the material is more shaper than shaped, and the idea is more shaped than shaper, but they're interactive. Historical materialism simply is taking these ideas and applying them to history. So history is moved by the hard material reality. Making enough food to live, carrying out enough production to transform nature so we can live from nature, etc., etc. Material reality, but it shapes religions, ideas, concepts, spiritualities, which in turn impact on our history. So it's a dialectical, materialist approach to explaining history. And that's called historical materialism, because if it's taken from this Marxist notion of dialectics, it incorporates the dialectics in itself. These are the basic ideas, and they have a lot to teach us because they are ways of interrogating not only the historical past, but the present. How do the hard economic realities of today shape the way people think, and how do the ways people think react back on to shape the reality we're living through? That would be a dialectical or historical materialist way to examine the present.
So there's all these anti-theory takes right now. There's this big debate around reading theory on TikTok right now, because apparently every TikTok I make has to turn into a debate that goes on for weeks afterwards. But it's all about, there's all these, don't tell people to read theory. It's not important. Who cares? It's really old theory. And then they're like, there was this one person who I like, a comrade, who was like, read Angela Davis, because Marx didn't say anything about the black community. And I'm like, yes, of course. That's what I'm saying, though. I'm saying there's a reason Angela Davis calls herself a Marxist, right? And if you listen to Richard Wolff's explanation of historical materialism there, it's very obvious why she would call herself a Marxist when writing books like Why Prisons Are Obsolete. Because she uses historical materialism to understand how the prison system developed, what makes it run, what are its roots, what is the reason for having, that the U.S. has more people incarcerated than any country on earth, 23% of the world's prison population, despite having like 4% of the world's population. And finds it's rooted in profit and the prison industrial complex, who lobbies the government to keep these things like the war on drugs going, to make sure the prisons are filled with bodies where they do prison labor, which you're allowed to pay. Corporations are allowed to pay under $1 an hour, right? And telecom companies make tons of money off those phone calls. Very few cases actually go to trial, and the way to get out is cash bail. So it's a giant money-making thing that thinkers like Angela Davis have been able to expose, and have exposed the blatant racism of it, and the way it has targeted minority communities in order to make a profit, using the dialectical materialist method, using historical materialism developed by Marx. That's why she calls herself a Marxist. And it's like, now you tell people to read theory, and there's like this huge backlash, which I feel like is some people got to be feds or CIA. We're like, no, don't read Marx. Only read Marxist thinkers from 2021. And it's like, well, there's a reason Marxist thinkers are calling themselves Marxist, because Marx figured out a lot of stuff and answered, a lot of came to a lot of conclusions about philosophical questions that have been posed for hundreds of thousands of years, and came up with this great method of analysis. that allows you to really see how society moves and the different motivations and impulses that different classes of people have. And there's nothing wrong with telling people to read that. And what I said was I get frustrated with my comrades who tell people not to read theory, and that was just a terrible idea. Because I made a video saying I get frustrated with comrades telling people not to read theory, and then it became a debate. And then there were like 100 videos of people saying don't read theory. I'm like, this one backfired. I should have just kept making videos talking about capital. Dang it!